Well, good morning and welcome to your Morning Manna. This week we're answering the question, what is communion? And so today and over the next couple of days, we're going to read through the account of the Last Supper. Now, all four of the Gospels describe the Last Supper between Jesus and his disciples, but we're going to read from Luke chapter 22. So let's read that together. Starting in verse 14, it says, "And when the hour came, he reclined at the table, and the apostles with him. And he said to them, I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer." You know, Jesus, he's talking about the Passover meal. In fact, if we go back a couple of verses, we see that Jesus he mentions the Passover in verse 7. It says, "Then came the day of unleavened bread," that's the same thing as Passover, "on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed." See, there's the evidence that there was lamb at the Passover meal on the Last Supper. Verse 8, "So Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, Go and prepare the Passover for us that we may eat it." Maybe you remember the famous story in the Old Testament about Moses and Pharaoh and the 10 plagues in Egypt. That's where we get this whole Passover from. And if you remember, the 10th and the final plague, it was the death of the firstborn. In other words, God was going to bring judgment and destruction to the firstborn of every household, every family, including the animals, all throughout Egypt. However, God gave his people a way out. He told each household to find a male lamb without blemish, and they were to kill that lamb at twilight. And then they were told to spread the blood on the doorpost of their home. And then the family would gather together, they would cook the meat, and they would eat all of the meat along with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. And that was called the Passover meal. Why Passover? Why was it called the Passover meal? Well, because God promised that when he brought death to all of the unborn, the firstborn children, that he would pass over any of the households whose doorposts were covered by the blood of the Lamb. And that's exactly what happened. God's people were spared. And from that point on, the Jews have been celebrating this momentous occasion. They called it Passover, or the Feast of Unleavened Bread, just to celebrate and commemorate God's mercy for his people. Now, fast forward 1,500 plus years later, you know, Jesus' ministry, it's coming to an end, and he's preparing for his coming death. And everything's culminating as he returns back to Jerusalem on the week that everyone's celebrating Passover. How fitting. The night before Jesus is crucified, he reclines at the table with his disciples for the Last Supper. Now, we call it the Last Supper. They would have just known it as the Passover meal. For them, this Passover meal was no different than all the Passover meals they've had previously in their lives. But in reality, something was different. They just didn't realize it. See, this time they weren't just eating lamb, they were eating with the Lamb, Jesus, who would be slain to cover their sins and ours. And see, it's at this occasion, during this Passover meal, that Jesus, he breaks the bread and he drinks the wine and he introduces the disciples to this sacrament that we call communion. Now, we're going to dive more into this later this week, but I want you to think about communion. And every time we think about communion and even this idea of the Passover, we see that they're inseparable. The whole Passover event was a foreshadowing of God's redemptive plan for all of mankind. Jesus was the Paschal Lamb who would be slain. It's his blood that would cover us. This is the new covenant. And every time we take communion, it acts as a symbol of this new covenant. We're celebrating the work of Jesus on the cross as the ultimate fulfillment of the Passover, so that just like the people in Exodus, just like the Israelites, we may be spared from God's judgment. What a majestic, beautiful picture of God's sacrifice and his mercy and love. May God bless you, and I'll see you tomorrow as we continue diving deeper.